There are discoveries that change the way a field understands itself, and then there are discoveries that change the way humanity understands itself. Most scientific breakthroughs belong to the first category. They are important, sometimes transformative within a particular discipline, but their implications stop at the boundary of the specialist community that produced them. Occasionally, however, a discovery crosses that boundary, a finding so fundamental, so startling in its implications, that it forces not merely scientists, but everyone who cares about human origins to revise their picture of where we came from and who we are. The re-sequencing of Ötzi, the Iceman's genome with the most advanced ancient DNA technology currently available, belongs to this second category. It does not merely update the scientific record. It forces a reconsideration of one of the most famous human beings who ever lived, and through him, a reconsideration of the story of prehistoric Europe itself. Otzi has been, since his discovery in 1991, the most studied ancient human in the world. Found frozen in the Alps on the border between what is now Italy and Austria, he has been subjected to more scientific scrutiny than any other prehistoric individual. CT scans, X-rays, isotopic analyses, gut content examinations, cardiovascular studies, analyses of his clothing, his tools, his tattoos, and his last meal. He's been the subject of documentaries, museum exhibitions, academic monographs, and popular books. He has been reconstructed, visualized, and debated with an intensity that no other mummy from any culture or period has attracted. And yet, for all that scrutiny, the genetic picture of Otzi that emerged from early sequencing efforts, published in the years following the first ancient DNA analyses of his remains, was substantially incomplete, and in some respects, substantially wrong. The new resequencing effort, using technology that did not exist when the earlier analyses were conducted, has produced a picture of Otzi's ancestry and biology that overturns several confident conclusions and raises questions that the earlier science was not equipped even to ask. To appreciate what the new findings reveal, it helps to understand who Otzi was thought to be before the resequencing, and why that picture was so compelling that it held for more than a decade of intensive scientific investigation. Otzi lived approximately 5,300 years ago during the Copper Age in Europe, a period of transition between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, when the use of copper tools was beginning to spread across the continent, but before the alloys and metallurgical techniques of the Bronze Age had been fully developed. He was a man in his mid-40s at the time of his death, old by the standards of his era, and the remarkable preservation of his remains in the glacial ice of the Alps allowed researchers to reconstruct his life in extraordinary detail. He had arthritis. He had hardened arteries. He had been recently wounded before the arrow that killed him struck him from behind. He carried in his gut the remnants of his last meal, red deer, ibex, einkorn wheat, and various wild plants, consumed in what appears to have been a mountain environment just hours before his death. His equipment was sophisticated, a copper axe of considerable technological refinement, a yew longbow that had not yet been strung, a quiver of arrows in various stages of completion, and clothing made from the hides and furs of multiple animal species sewn together with impressive skill. The early genetic analyses, conducted with sequencing technology available in the mid-2000s and refined in subsequent years, produced a picture of Otzi's ancestry that placed him primarily within the population of early European farmers, people who had migrated into Europe from Anatolia in what is now Turkey, beginning around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, bringing agriculture with them and spreading across the continent in a demographic wave that gradually displaced the hunter-gatherer populations that had inhabited Europe since the end of the last ice age. This Anatolian farmer ancestry, the early analyses suggested, made up the dominant component of Otzi's genome, with a smaller contribution from Western hunter-gatherers, the ancient forager populations of pre-agricultural Europe. The picture was consistent with what researchers expected given Otzi's time period and location. A Copper-Age man in the Alps, descended primarily from the farming migrants who had reshaped European demography over the preceding several thousand years, with some admixture from the hunter-gatherer populations his ancestors had encountered and partially displaced. That picture was not wrong, exactly, but it was incomplete in ways that the new resequencing has exposed with considerable precision. And the ways in which it was incomplete turn out to matter enormously, not just for understanding Otzi specifically, but for understanding the broader demographic history of prehistoric Europe during one of its most consequential periods. The new resequencing used sequencing technology and analytical methods that represent a significant advance over what was available even a few years ago. Ancient DNA degrades over time, and the DNA extracted from remains thousands of years old is typically highly fragmented, broken into short pieces that are difficult to assemble correctly and easy to contaminate with modern DNA from researchers, laboratory environments, and the microorganisms that colonize ancient remains over the centuries. The earliest ancient DNA analyses were conducted when the field was still developing protocols to deal with these challenges, and the results, while groundbreaking at the time, incorporated errors and gaps that better methods have since made it possible to identify and correct. The new analysis produced a genome of significantly higher coverage than previous efforts, meaning that each position in Otzi's genome was sequenced many more times, reducing the likelihood of errors and allowing researchers to call genetic variants with much greater confidence. It also incorporated the dramatically expanded comparative database of ancient genomes that has been assembled over the past decade, as sequencing projects across Europe, Asia, and beyond have filled in the ancient genomic record with a density and geographic coverage that simply did not exist when the earlier Otzi analyses were conducted. This expanded reference database allows researchers to place Otzi's genome within a much richer context, to compare him not just to modern populations and a handful of other ancient individuals, but to hundreds of ancient genomes spanning thousands of years and dozens of archaeological cultures across the continent. What they found when they did so was surprising. Not surprising in a way that inverts the basic picture. Otzi's dominant ancestry is still from Anatolian farmers, as the earlier analyses showed, but surprising in the proportions, surprising in what is absent, and deeply surprising in what the new physical trait predictions say about what Otzi actually looked like. The single most striking finding of the new resequencing concerns Otzi's appearance, specifically his skin color. The earlier analyses, when they attempted to predict Otzi's physical traits from his genome, suggested that he likely had relatively light skin, consistent with the European populations whose descendants carry the genetic variants associated with reduced melanin production. Reconstructions of Otzi, produced for museums and documentaries and popular articles over the years, depicted him accordingly. A pale or lightly tanned man with dark hair and dark eyes, the face of a recognizably European ancestral type. Those reconstructions became canonical. They were reproduced endlessly, appearing on the covers of scientific journals and natural history museum displays across Europe and North America, shaping the mental image of Otzi that tens of millions of people carry. The new resequencing overturns this picture completely. The higher quality genome reveals that Otzi did not have light skin. He had dark skin, among the darkest predicted for any ancient European individual yet sequenced. He also had dark eyes, and he was genetically predisposed to be bald or significantly balding at the time of his death. The fair-skinned, dark-haired reconstruction that has defined Otzi's image for 3 decades is, in light of the new evidence, simply wrong. The man who lay frozen in the Alps for 300 years looked substantially different from the man who has been displayed in museums and educational materials around the world. This finding requires some explanation because it is counterintuitive given what most people understand about the relationship between European ancestry and skin pigmentation. The key is that the genetic variants associated with light skin pigmentation in modern Europeans were not uniformly present in prehistoric European populations. They were, in significant part, introduced or increased in frequency by the migrations of the Bronze Age steppe peoples, the Amnaya and related populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, who swept into Europe beginning around 5,000 years ago, bringing with them a genetic profile that has shaped the modern European genome profoundly. Otzi died before those migrations reached the Alpine region. His genome reflects the pigmentation profile of the Anatolian farmers who were his primary ancestors. People who, genetic evidence increasingly suggests, were considerably darker skinned than their descendants in modern Europe, before the pigmentation lightening variants of the steppe migrants spread through the European gene pool. The discovery that Otzi was dark-skinned is not an isolated finding. It is consistent with what resequencing of other early European farmers has begun to show, that the shift toward lighter skin pigmentation in European populations was a more recent development than previously assumed, driven in significant part by the demographic changes of the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, rather than by the earlier spread of farming itself. But Otzi is the most famous individual in whom this pattern has been identified, and the contrast between the canonical, pale, skinned reconstruction and the dark-skinned reality it replaces is stark enough to have attracted substantial popular attention. Attention that raises important questions about how ancient human appearance is communicated to the public and how quickly the canonical images that shape public understanding can become outdated. The ancestral proportions revealed by the new resequencing are equally significant. The earlier analyses suggested that Otzi carried a mixture of Anatolian farmer ancestry and Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, the two major genetic components that researchers expected to find mixed together in a Copper Age individual from the Alps. The new, higher-quality genome tells a more precise story, and that story is substantially different from the one the earlier data suggested. Otzi's genome, as revealed by the new analysis, shows a remarkably high proportion of Anatolian farmer ancestry, higher than almost any other ancient individual from a comparable time period and location yet analyzed. More strikingly, his genome shows a much lower proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry than the earlier analyses had suggested. The hunter-gatherer component that previous researchers identified in Otzi's genome appears to have been, in significant part, an artifact of the earlier, lower-quality sequencing and the less complete comparative database available at the time. When the analysis is redone with the better data, Otzi emerges as an individual whose ancestry was almost entirely derived from the Anatolian farming migration. A man who was, in genomic terms, much more closely connected to his Anatolian farmer forebears than to the hunter-gatherer populations that had preceded them in the Alps. This finding has significant implications for understanding the demographic history of the Alpine region during the Copper Age. It suggests that in some areas of Europe, the Anatolian farmer migration was even more demographically complete than researchers had previously recognized. Stas, that the hunter-gatherer populations in certain regions were not merely reduced and partially absorbed by the incoming farmers, but were effectively replaced by them, leaving very little genetic legacy in the populations that followed. Otzi's genome, in this reading, is the genome of a people who had accomplished nearly total demographic dominance in their local environment, a population of farmers whose genetic roots lay thousands of miles to the east, in the agricultural communities of Anatolia, but who had been settled in the Alps long enough to have lost most genomic connection to the hunter-gatherers who had hunted those same mountains before them. The new resequencing also shed light on Otzi's health in ways that extend well beyond the physical examination of his mummy. His genome contains a number of variants associated with cardiovascular disease risk, variants that contributed to the arterial hardening that physical examination of his mummy had already identified. The presence of these risk variants in a man who died 5 through 2,800 years ago, living a physically demanding life, far removed from the dietary and lifestyle risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease in the modern world, is a reminder that the genetic underpinnings of many diseases are ancient, predating the behaviors and environments that activate them in contemporary populations. His genome also reveals a predisposition to obesity, not expressed presumably in a man whose physical lifestyle and caloric constraints made obesity essentially impossible, but present at the genetic level, waiting for an environment that never came. This kind of latent genetic predisposition, common in ancient genomes, speaks to the long evolutionary history of traits that have become medically significant only in the context of the modern world, traits that were neutral or even beneficial in ancestral environments, where caloric scarcity was the norm, but have become risk factors in an environment of dietary abundance. Otzi carries within his genome a vivid illustration of this principle. The man who lived and died by physical exertion in the mountains harbored the genetic seeds of diseases that his lifestyle never allowed to germinate, seeds that, in his descendants, living in a world he could not have imagined, may have come eventually to bloom. The Helicobacter pylori bacteria found in Otzi's gut, identified in earlier analyses, was re-examined in the context of the new genomic data, and yielded additional insights about ancient disease ecology and the relationship between human population movements and the microbial communities that traveled with them. The particular strain of H. pylori in Otzi's gut is an ancient Asian strain, consistent with what researchers would expect given his Anatolian farmer ancestry. A reminder that the human microbiome, like the human genome, carries a record of the migrations and population movements that shaped our species' history. We are not the only passengers on the journey of human prehistory. The microbes we carry with us are passengers too, and their genomes tell stories that complement and sometimes extend what our own DNA reveals. There is a question that hangs over all the new findings, a question that is more cultural and philosophical than strictly scientific, but that the scientific findings make unavoidable. What do we do with the reconstructions? The canonical image of Otzi, fair-skinned, dark-haired, weathered, but recognizably European in the sense that modern audiences understand, has been reproduced in museums across the world. It has shaped the way millions of people visualize prehistoric Europe. It has been the face on the book covers, the figure in the documentaries, the mannequin behind the glass. And it is wrong in ways that matter. Wrong about something as fundamental as the color of a man's skin, a characteristic that carries enormous social weight in the contemporary world, precisely because of the long history of racism and racial categorization that has made skin color a marker of identity and belonging. The challenge of updating those reconstructions, of replacing a pale Otzi with a dark-skinned one across hundreds of museum displays, educational materials, and popular media, is not merely logistical. It is a reminder of how quickly the science of ancient genomics is moving, and how difficult it is for public understanding and public representation to keep pace. Every reconstruction that museums commission, every visualization that documentary producers generate, is based on the best available science at the time it is made. But the best available science at any given time is provisional, subject to revision as methods improve and comparative databases expand. The Otzi case makes that provisionality unusually vivid, because the revision involves not some abstract ancestral proportion, but a concrete, visible physical characteristic that is immediately legible to anyone who looks at a reconstruction. The Otzi, who looked like a light-skinned European ancestor, and the Otzi, who looked considerably different, are not the same person, and the difference between them is not a detail. For researchers working on prehistoric European demography, The new Otzi data arrives at a moment when the field's understanding of the Copper Age is itself in flux. The period in which Otzi lived, roughly 3300 BCE, was, as the broader ancient DNA literature is increasingly making clear, a time of significant demographic and cultural change across the continent. The Anatolian farming populations that had spread across Europe over the preceding several thousand years were themselves about to be substantially transformed by the steppe migrations that would begin within a few centuries of Otzi's death. Migrations that would introduce the genetic ancestry, the languages, and the cultural practices that would eventually give rise to the Indo-European speaking populations of historical Europe. Otzi lived, in this sense, at the end of one chapter of European prehistory, just before the opening of the next. His genome, with its extraordinarily high proportion of Anatolian farmer ancestry and its near absence of Western hunter-gatherer admixture, is a snapshot of a population at the peak of its demographic success, a farming community that had so thoroughly colonized its alpine environment that the traces of those who had been there before had almost entirely faded from the genetic record. Within a few centuries, that population would itself be substantially transformed by the steppe migrations, whose genetic signature would spread through the alpine region and across Europe with a speed and completeness that archaeologists are still struggling to explain. Otzi does not carry that steppe ancestry. He died before it arrived. He is, in this sense, the last representative of a European demographic order that was about to be remade. A man of the old world standing on the threshold of a transformation he could not have anticipated. What the resequencing of Otzi's genome ultimately demonstrates is something that the ancient DNA field has been demonstrating, study by study and genome by genome, for the past decade, that our understanding of the human past is not fixed. It is a living body of knowledge, subject to revision as the tools of investigation improve, and as the accumulation of data allows patterns to be seen that were invisible when only isolated fragments of the record were available. The picture of Otzi that emerged from the first sequencing efforts was the best picture that the science of that moment could produce. It was not negligent or fraudulent. It was an honest representation of what the technology and the comparative database available at that time could reveal. The new picture is better, more accurate, more complete, richer in its implications, because the science is better, and the science will continue to improve, which means the picture of Otzi, like the picture of human prehistory generally, will continue to be refined. That is not a reason for uncertainty or despair. It is, if anything, a reason for wonder. Otzi has been dead for 5,300 years. He died in the mountains, killed by an arrow, and lay frozen in the ice while empires rose and fell, and the world he knew became the world we know. And yet the information encoded in his genome, the record of his ancestry, his health, his appearance, his place in the long story of human migration and admixture, survived those 5 millennia, waiting for the moment when the science would be sophisticated enough to read it. We are now, for the first time, approaching the point where we can read it with something close to completeness. The Otzi who emerges from that reading is darker skinned, more purely of Anatolian farmer descent, and, in some respects, more surprising than the man who has been displayed in museums for 30 years. But he is also more real, a more accurate representation of a specific human being who lived a specific life in a specific place at a specific moment in history. The genome, as always, does not lie. It carries its truth patiently, across millennia, through the degradation of ice and time, waiting for the tools that can finally read it correctly. Those tools now exist, and the reading they have produced, in the case of the most famous ancient human in the world, has changed, quietly, irrevocably, and with implications that neither science nor culture has yet fully absorbed, what we thought we knew about who Otzi was, and through him, who we are. The broader significance of the Otzi resequencing extends beyond the individual findings about one man's ancestry and appearance. It raises a question that the ancient DNA field is only beginning to grapple with seriously. What is the relationship between the science of ancient genomics and the public understanding of the human past? Museums, documentaries, textbooks, and popular science journalism have all invested heavily in communicating the findings of ancient DNA research to non-specialist audiences. That communication has, on the whole, been remarkably successful. The story of ancient human migrations, of Neanderthal admixture, of the demographic revolutions of the Neolithic and Bronze Age, has captured widespread public attention and reshaped popular understanding of prehistory in ways that earlier generations of archaeologists could not have imagined. But the Otzi case illustrates a persistent vulnerability in this communication. The findings of ancient DNA research change faster than the infrastructure of public understanding can adapt to them. When the first Otzi genomic analyses were published and museums commissioned new reconstructions to reflect the genetic findings, those reconstructions represented the state of the art. They were accurate representations of what the science said at the time. But the science has now moved on, and the reconstructions have not. The pale-skinned Otzi continues to stand behind glass in the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, the primary repository of his remains and the institution most directly responsible for communicating his story to the public, even as the genomic evidence that justified that reconstruction has been substantially revised. The museum has acknowledged the new findings and indicated that updates to the reconstruction are being considered. But the process of updating a physical museum installation is slow and expensive, and in the meantime, the outdated image continues to reach visitors by the hundreds of thousands each year. This gap between scientific knowledge and public representation is not unique to the Ötzi case. It is a structural feature of the relationship between fast-moving science and slow-moving public communication infrastructure. But it is particularly visible in the Otzi case because the discrepancy involves something as immediately legible and personally resonant as skin color. Visitors to the South Tyrol Museum look at the reconstruction and see a person who looks broadly like the people around them, a light-skinned European man of ancient vintage, a recognizable ancestor. The genomic evidence says that is not quite right. The man they are looking at, had he walked into the museum alive, would have looked considerably different. Darker-skinned, almost certainly bald, his eyes dark, his face a reminder that the European past was not uniformly pale, that the pigmentation profile of modern Europeans is itself a relatively recent product of migration and demographic change. What remains, and what the new resequencing has brought into sharper focus than ever before, is the portrait of a man who was in many ways representative of his time and place. A Copper Age farmer of Anatolian descent, living in a world that was about to be remade by forces he could not have perceived, and in other ways utterly singular, preserved by chance, studied by science, and revealed generation by generation as a window into a past that would otherwise be entirely inaccessible. He is not who we thought he was. He is darker, more purely derived from his farming ancestors, more completely a man of one particular world rather than a blend of the worlds that preceded it. And in being different from what we expected, he is more interesting, more human, more specific, more genuinely himself than the generic ancient European that earlier science had inadvertently projected onto him. The ice kept his secret for 300 years. The science is finally fully reading it. And what it says is worth listening to.